actually find myself to be a rather creative child from the very beginning. So ever since I was a little girl, I would be very interested in drawing and reading and writing various things. And when I got into secondary school, I was fortunate enough to be able to attend sort of elective Chinese creative writing lessons that my school was offering as an extracurricular at the time. Some of the teachers are very prominent names in the Hong Kong literary scene, including Mr. Dong Kai-cheng, who is still a friend to this day. And in those writing classes, I realized that creative writing, especially in Chinese, is a medium that I really enjoy because it sort of doesn't have a lot of physical limitations to what I can do. So as long as I can imagine it and I can put it in words on paper, then anything is possible. I didn't have to, for example, wait for paint to dry if I were doing painting. I didn't have to find a space to move around if I were to express myself through movement and dance, or I didn't have to wait for people to be. I didn't have to wait for the room to quiet down before I play music to express myself. So I found that writing gave me a sort of voice and outlet for my creative power since then, and the creative writing classes introduced me to the wonderful world of Hong Kong literature and fiction writing in particular. So from then on, I started writing when I was in secondary school, and I started writing in a local newspaper every week and published quite a number of short stories during my A-levels, and I collected them into my first short story collection by the time I entered university. And I was reading comparative literature in the University of Hong Kong, as well as psychology as my undergrad. And after that, I went to London to pursue a Masters of Arts in English at King's College London, which I hope gave me a bit more of an exposure to the literary world outside of what I'd already known. And to this day, I'm still very grateful that I had that sort of early exposure to creative writing and literature back in the very first year of secondary school, and I'm very happy that I've been writing ever since. I would definitely say that my home would be Hong Kong. I've been increasingly aware that I am a person who happens to live on planet Earth as a Homo sapien, but I was born in Hong Kong, I was raised here, and I live here every day, and a lot of the things that I see in everyday life becomes my influences in writing. So it is very difficult for me to imagine calling any other place home in this great planet than Hong Kong. So I would definitely say that if I were to describe my cultural identity, it would be a Hong Konger who likes to travel around and look at other things in the world outside of Hong Kong, but ultimately a lot of the stories that I am able to tell comes from here. I definitely consider myself a Hong Kong writer, and I would hope that the stories I tell add a voice to the body of works that come out of Hong Kong in terms of creative writing. I believe very strongly that every person who writes, whether you take it as a sort of hobby or if you're a serious person who wants to do writing for your entire life, that you have a unique voice, and the stories that you tell can only be told by you. Even if we experience the same things living in the same city, we will not be able to tell the same story. So every story counts. And I do hope that by adding my stories to the incredible range of narratives coming out of Hong Kong, we would be able to see a little bit of this wonderful city that is seen through my lens and my experiences. I would say that I am a huge fan of Hong Kong literature to a point where I cannot imagine what my life would be if I hadn't been so interested in it. A lot of times people like to throw around the cliche that Hong Kong has no culture, this is the cultural desert, and writing has no future or anything in this sort of city that places a lot of emphasis on pursuits other than creative arts. But I would say that Hong Kong literature has helped me see the world around me in terms of how the city came into being, how the people that we share a city with, the people who came before us, the generations before us, lived their lives in the same physical space that we occupy now. And we can, through Hong Kong literature, imagine what kind of life we can live in Hong Kong in the present or in the future. So it is something that is very dear to my heart. I'm very passionate about it. If I were to sort of describe what I think Hong Kong literature is to a general sort of idea, I would say that it's such a passionate and diverse sort of body of works because, like I've said, Hong Kong isn't particularly a place that rewards people financially or otherwise for being creative. We're not exactly known for encouraging people to pursue a career in arts. But despite all of that, generations and generations of writers have worked so hard to put their stories out there for us to read. And I know that a lot of people are still doing it, including myself. And for us all to sort of pursue this without a lot of monetary gain or sort of fame or anything more tangible or rewarding that comes with it, that takes a lot of passion collectively. So I would say that we are a bunch of people that are very passionate about what we do, and we're willing to do it whether people are reading it or not. And I'm glad to say that I see a lot of people appreciating Hong Kong literature and sharing this kind of passion. And the sort of voice that Hong Kong literature likes to give off is that we each are allowed to define our own experiences. There's no one unified way of going about writing about this city, or there's no one tradition in terms of writing style that everyone has to follow. Everyone is allowed to invent their own or engage in dialogue with what has come before us in terms of the lineage of work that has been around before we started writing or reading. So I think it's a very sort of healthy balance of respecting tradition while staking your own claim as a person with a unique voice. So these are the things that I think characterizes Hong Kong literature to me. Basically, every time people ask me who are the writers that I admire, I will always start with Xi. She's a personal hero of mine, and I like to think that she's a good friend. I have the incredible privilege of knowing her in person these few years, but way before I met her and became her friend, I had been admiring her work from a distance ever since I started learning about this thing called literature. When I was a student in the Chinese creative writing classes as an extracurricular activity in secondary school, I was introduced to her poetry, her prose, her short stories, and her novels. And every single piece of work that I've encountered that came from Xi spoke to me in a way that transcends sort of artistic sort of it's a sort of connection that isn't just because it's an incredible story, but that I can see that she sees the world in a similar way that I do. She sees the world in a very gentle way. She focuses on the little details in everyday life and the goodness and kindness in a lot of it, without ignoring a lot of the suffering or the inevitable pains that we as human beings may share as we go through our lives. And it gives me a lot of inspiration and a sense of companionship that there is this great writer living in the same city that I am, who has been writing for her entire life and telling stories that still speaks to me. And I have the amazing opportunity of meeting her and becoming her friend these few years. And I've also been very fortunate to be able to present her works in various ways, including helping edit one of the special issues in Fleur de Lettres, or Zifa, a local literary magazine, with a special issue dedicated to Xixi last year. And I've also adapted 2 of Xixi's famous short stories, A Girl Like Me and The Cold, into a Cantonese language chamber opera. So that was a very innovative way of going about, both in terms of chamber opera and taking Hong Kong literature from the form of written text to a different genre of art. So both personally as a reader and as a creative person and as an editor, I find her work to be incredibly, incredibly inspiring, and that I really, really couldn't imagine what kind of person I would be if I haven't met this great person and have been introduced to her work. Okay, the other writer that I have always found very inspiring to me is the late and great Lau Yicheng. As a person who primarily writes short stories and fiction, his dedication to writing, both in terms of writing a lot of works very quickly so that we get to see a lot of different styles from him, and his obsession with creating new forms and new ways of telling stories. Both of these things are very inspiring to me and influential to my own personal writing style. So I was also introduced to his works when I was in secondary school doing creative writing after class. And I remember him saying in an interview that you have to try something new every time. It might not be perfect every time, but you have to try and do something new. And that is a sort of mantra that I've given myself when I first started writing short stories, particularly. I had to produce 1 short story every week for the newspaper when I was 17 years old. So it took a lot of work to try and come up with new ways to tell stories when you have to produce works so quickly and so consistently for over a year. But Lau Yicheng used to write in newspaper columns as well. He's very famous for being able to write so many stories at the same time. Some he would characterize as something that is just for perhaps a more lowbrow audience, I'll put that in quotes. But some he would be writing for his own artistic pursuits and pleasure. And I find his tenacity in writing and his ability to produce a huge amount of good works quickly and innovatively to be very inspiring. So I have always tried to follow in that direction in challenging myself to find new ways to write short stories and pay a lot of attention to the form and language of short stories and how they actually play into the theme of the short stories, so that the form also helps to tell the story. So Lau Yicheng would definitely be on the list of writers that I really like from Hong Kong. Last but not least, another writer that I really, really admire would be Yasi, who also passed away recently. I had the opportunity of meeting him when I started becoming interested in creative writing. When I was a teenager, I would go around the city with some of my friends who also share the same passion to attend a lot of sharing sessions and public speeches given by local writers. And a lot of times after that, we would go and have tea in a restaurant nearby. And for some reason, I seemed to keep running into Yasi, and he had been very kind and very encouraging to young people. And I'm sure a lot of writers and students in Hong Kong who have had the pleasure of meeting him would agree that he is a very warm presence, and he is not shy in showing his support for people that he thinks has sort of talent in creative writing. And I've always admired Yasi's poetry, although I rarely or almost never write poetry. Yasi's poetry really touches me in a lot of ways. For example, he would be able to take everyday experiences and present them through a lens of knowledge, through intertextuality, and through speaking to cultures outside of Hong Kong, or speaking to moments in history or in art or in film. The sort of idea that he had with using literature as a way to communicate with other art forms and with other people is something that I find fascinating and very important to me as well. So when I was 20 years old, I published my first book, and at that time I was invited to an interview with a journalist in a cafe, and I didn't know that Yasi would actually be in the same cafe at the same time as he was being interviewed by the same newspaper. So when I arrived at the cafe, Yasi greeted me very kindly, and the journalist recognized that we knew each other. So she invited Yasi to comment on my works, and I was very nervous because I was almost a nobody who had just published her first book as a 20-year-old person who was still very, very nervous about whether I actually have what it takes to be a good writer, or whether the book that I had just published is actually up to par, when I know that there's so many great writers already with the brilliant books that had inspired me so much, and I was just a newcomer to this sort of scene. But in the cafe, Yasi was so kind and generous with his words that he praised my works and said that he was very pleasantly surprised that such a young person was able to produce stories that were so interesting. And that is a sort of anecdote in demonstrating how I see Yasi as a writer from Hong Kong who sort of paved the way in a lot of things and was not shy in giving out compliments and encouraging the younger generation to pursue their passions in creative writing. I think that, combined with the admiration I already had for his poetry and his other forms of writing, there's a special place in my heart for Yasi, definitely. I would definitely say that I find a lot of similarities in my own writing compared to Xixi. That could be because I started learning about creative writing by reading Xixi's work, and also because I do feel like we see the world in a very similar way. I would sometimes like to joke that I find myself to be from the same planet as Xixi, in a sense that we seem to naturally gravitate towards certain topics and ways of connecting with the world. For example, Xixi is very well known for her childlike wonder of everything that happens around us, including the most mundane of things. Perhaps a new laundromat that suddenly opened in your neighborhood, or whether the lines in the post office have been shortened because fewer people are actually posting physical letters in this age of technology. Or we would pay a lot of attention to the news that happened in the world and go about speaking about these incidences or issues in a way that shows that we care, but we do not go about screaming angrily. Rather, we would engage in a sort of conversation or present a way of trying to understand it in our gentle and sort of soft-spoken manner, but still with a very distinct point of view. I find that to be something that I have a lot of connection with in terms of Xishi's work, and I try to do that with my own writing as well. Most prominently in the third short story collection I've published called Lam Yip Dik Se Gui. So it is about a 10-year-old boy who finds fascination with everything in the city, and particularly the elements of nature that we find in this concrete jungle. So for example, he would be drawn to the little birds that you see flying around in Central. He would pay a lot of attention to the dogs that walk in the streets, or he would like to defamiliarize a lot of experiences in daily life. So he would think that the person carrying a tray of freshly baked pineapple buns is actually a performer in a circus because he could lift something so easily and without dropping it and ruining all the bread. Or he would think that a squid in the window of a Cantonese barbecue shop is actually an alien. Or that the person who sealed the top of a cup of bubble tea perfectly to a point where you can flip it over without anything spilling over must be a rocket scientist who found a way to defy gravity. I find that using this sort of defamiliarization helped me understand the world in a completely different and childlike perspective, which could actually lead me to some new ways of seeing the world and some truths behind it. And I think a lot of Xishi's work also employs a similar tactic in understanding the world as well. I would say that there's a tradition of using some of the techniques that Xishi is known for by other Hong Kong writers, especially those who engage with a form of fiction. Most specifically, I was thinking about how Xishi started sort of very famously wrote these. I do think that there's a tradition in writing about Hong Kong that we can probably trace back to Xishi about trying to describe Hong Kong by giving it a nickname that is unique to each writer. So we probably all know that Xishi famously wrote Marvels of the Floating City, which is treated as a very famous political allegory of the situation of Hong Kong when it was still a colony of Britain and the fate of the city after 1997 was being discussed. By deliberately misreading paintings of Magritte, Xishi was able to create a narrative about a floating city that we can recognize as Hong Kong, but was not explicitly stated so. I think this sort of way of talking about Hong Kong opens up a lot of possibilities of the writer presenting what she thinks Hong Kong is to her and what it could be. I think this sort of space created by giving Hong Kong a nickname is inherited by the generations of writers after her. So we see Dong Kai-jiang writing in a lot of ways that weaves together real pieces of history with fictional stories that speaks to that piece of history. In particular, I was thinking about the book, The Atlas, if I'm not mistaken, where he basically wrote a sort of half-true, half-fake history about a lot of things in Hong Kong. There's also a lot of writers after Xishi who has created various nicknames for Hong Kong and tried to define the city or describe it in a way that is very, very unique to each writer. And I have also tried doing this in the first book that I've published. So when I was writing about real life events that happened in Hong Kong or elsewhere in the world in my first short story collection, I gave Hong Kong the nickname of City Y because I felt like I needed that safe space created by a nickname and the form of fiction for me to sort of understand and present what I saw as reality. Because at that time, I was acutely aware that I was only a very young person. I was about 17 or 18 at the time. There was a lot of things I didn't know about the real world of Hong Kong or how life actually works. But I was confident that I knew what I saw or what I'd experienced, or the emotional connection or intellectual thoughts that I had when I saw the news at the time. So by giving Hong Kong the nickname of City Y, I felt like I could safely explore what real life events in Hong Kong meant to me. For example, what does it mean if a tree fell in Hong Kong and killed a girl that was similar to my age? Or what did it mean when there was swine flu in Hong Kong? Those are very new ideas to me as a young person. And if I were to stake a claim as an authority in analyzing why trees fall in Hong Kong, or how infections and viruses work in a public health context, that would definitely not be convincing, and that would make me very nervous, actually. But in fiction, I was able to create a fictional city, to speak about it, and to address these real-life issues, just like Xixi did. So I would say that that is my way of engaging in a sort of tradition that a lot of fellow writers in Hong Kong, in generations before me and in the same generation as I am, have been doing, that we can probably trace back to Xixi. So I would definitely say that there's a thread in a sort of literary tradition in Hong Kong that is heavily involved with Xixi. The city of Hong Kong is definitely very influential in my writing and who I am as a person. I would go so far as to say that I would definitely not be the writer that I am today if I weren't born and raised here. I am fascinated by the history of Hong Kong. I would go and do research about it for fun and try to bring that element into my own fiction. I am also really fascinated by the hybrid use of language that Hong Kongers are so used to. We speak Cantonese as our mother tongue most of the time for most people in Hong Kong, but at the same time, our language is actually influenced a lot by English, which is also an official language of Hong Kong. We would have words taken from other cultures and languages, such as from mainland China, from Taiwan, most of that through popular culture or from reading, because we all write in written Chinese. We would also borrow words from Japanese or from Korean, even from other languages in the world. And that is something that is very natural to us. And sometimes even we can switch between languages just to address a point or to speak to a different audience. I think that it was very interesting in seeing how these sort of language influences can affect writing in Chinese in Hong Kong. So recently I've been experimenting a lot with bringing Cantonese into the written form. I've been exploring how to use Cantonese in the form of a chamber opera, which is something that not a lot of people have done, and I don't see a lot of people doing it in the world. And I'm very proud that I get the opportunity to do that by adapting two of Xixi's short stories into a Cantonese language chamber opera. And I also find Hong Kong to be a place where I was able to engage in a conversation with via my writing and the various other things that I do about literature. I'm very lucky that I see there are people in Hong Kong, or perhaps even outside of Hong Kong, who enjoy my stories and find that they present an aspect of Hong Kong that they find relevant and thought-provoking or enjoyable in general. And that makes me feel like I truly belong to this place called Hong Kong, because the things that I speak about, the language I use, are all from Hong Kong. You would be seeing people on trams in Hong Kong in my stories. You would see them eating the sort of foods that we are all familiar with. And all these stories would be told using written Chinese in a way that stays true to all these strange language influences from all over the place that actually defines the sort of way we speak in Hong Kong. So I would say that writing about Hong Kong sort of helps define who I am, and I'm glad that I was able to use my stories to sort of speak to everyone who are willing to join me in conversation by reading one of my stories. I think every writer would have a unique relationship with their translator. Recently, I've been working very closely and frequently with a very talented Jennifer Feely, who you may know as very famously the translator of a lot of important works by Xi. Jennifer and I met in Hong Kong once, and at the time she didn't really get to speak to me a lot because she was quite busy with a lot of engagements, and I was pretty busy with my engagements. But afterwards we connected on the internet and started talking and found opportunities where she could try and translate my works, because she had heard from Xi and other people that my short stories are quite interesting. And that's sort of started our collaboration as writer and translator. The way we work together is that we work rather closely. She would ask me a lot of questions when she find things that she's not clear about in the stories. Sometimes it's because I use some rather obscure references in Cantonese or references to Hong Kong culture that she might not be familiar with. Or sometimes I might just make a typo or make an error in my original writing. I should jot those down and send me questions. And I will always be happy to answer them or sort of present to her my ideas or my intentions behind doing certain things in the stories. I think this sort of collaboration worked a lot for us because we are very open to each other in terms of asking questions and getting feedback. And that Jennifer is a translator who is not afraid of a good challenge if the story is worth her engaging in that sort of challenge. Because sometimes I do find that I don't make life easy for anyone who wants to translate my stories, because I use so much Cantonese and so much wordplay that a lot of tiny things in the stories could take a lot of time searching for a solution to the trick that the language imposes. But Jennifer is always up to the challenge, and she always surprises me with all these great and innovative ways of taking my stories from Chinese to English and having it received so well in the English readership. So I'm very glad that we found each other and have such a good working relationship. And I do feel like translators are very important. Translators are very important to writers, both as companions in the creative pursuit that could possibly be very lonely if you don't have people in your corner rooting for you when you don't hear a lot of feedback from readers, but also as someone who truly understands your work as a translator, or who is willing to help you reach a wider readership by taking your writing from one language to another, thus a readership to another. That would be something very encouraging and very beneficial to a writer if they can find a very good translator who are willing to be their friend and can do an excellent job in translating the work and helping share with more people. So I would definitely say that the relationship between a translator and a writer is a very personal one, a very professional one at the same time, and a very special one. Writing the libretto to a chamber opera is one of the most challenging and wonderful things that I've ever had the opportunity to do. Firstly, because I didn't actually have any formal training in the form of chamber opera, and I had to learn very quickly along the way by finding good references and teachers from various fields who might have different tools in their toolkits that could help me in writing a good libretto. So I would be looking at poetry to figure out how I could go about with the language aspect of it, because I would like my libretto to have a very poetic language. I would turn to very experienced readers of Xixi stories to try and make sure I understand all the nuances in the original stories, so that in my adaptation I can stay true to the spirit of Xixi's short stories. I also spoke to some friends who actually studied music in university, who probably had some ideas about what composing and working with a composer means. And our composer, Daniel Lo, is actually incredibly helpful in the process, because he's an incredible teacher who has a talent of making things very simple for you and explaining things so quickly that you feel confident working with him, that you can ask him anything and he would help you understand some of the difficult points in the working process. So I'm very glad that I had these people around me who were able to share their knowledge and wisdom with me. So that whole learning process and trying to gain confidence as a first-time librettist was very new to me, because when I started working on the libretto of the Cantonese language chamber opera, I had already been publishing my short stories for over 10 years. And for me to start jumping into a new genre as someone completely new, that took me some time in learning to pick up this new art form and to build up enough confidence in myself. And I'm very glad that I had that kind of experience to sort of be a newcomer all over again. Another thing that makes writing a libretto very different from my own writing is that writing a libretto is a collaborative process. To my understanding, the form of the chamber opera has a primary goal of allowing the singers to showcase their beautiful voices and vocal techniques. That relies on beautifully written music. But the music often relies on the libretto, which is the first thing being written in the case of our collaboration between me and our composer Daniel Lo. So understanding that the writing is an important foundation to the whole performance, but also a tool to serve the purpose of presenting great music and great singing, sort of shifts the power balance in the collaborative process as well. So when we were working together on the libretto, I would write a first draft based on an agreed upon story outline that the composer and I have talked about, but I would write whatever I want in terms of the language, in terms of how I want to use metaphors and all that. And after I have written the first draft, I would sit down with the composer and we would discuss how we can reshape the structure of what I have written to a form that is both true to my vision as a creative writer and a librettist, and to the composer's vision of what he needs from the libretto to be able to write good music. And after that, I would take the draft back home and rewrite it in a way that would make everybody happy and meet the very high standards that we all have for ourselves in the team, and come up with a very polished final product, which will still be further polished along the way when we start actually composing or start rehearsals. And it can actually last very long in terms of time if we were to do this very properly. And we do have that kind of luxury working on this project to spend, I think, about a year or so on just writing the libretto itself. And usually when I write my own stories, it could maybe take a few days or maybe up to a month to finish a short story. But the libretto took so long with so many revisions and polishings that I felt like I made a diamond, because it was made with so much concentration and so much pressure placed on myself to make it perfect. So that was a sort of moment that I find that this perhaps is what art can be like, where you seek perfection to this sort of extent, where you would rope your friends in and help you grind on it until you have it perfect. So I think that experience was also very unique compared to writing short stories as well. In terms of translation, the libretto that I've written this time for the Chamber Opera commissioned by the Hong Kong Arts Festival is also translated by Jennifer Feely, who is a translator of my short stories and Xishi's works at the same time. So she's a perfect fit for translating this particular libretto, because she would have the knowledge of Xishi's works as the original form. She would know what kind of language that I usually use to write. And she also takes this project very seriously, because she is also a huge fan of Xishi's work. And we share that sort of passion and willingness and desire to make this project as perfect as possible. So when we were talking about how the translations can happen, I actually wrote her quite a number of notes on the margins of the libretto, telling her exactly what references I used. So for example, if I were talking about a phoenix crown, I would tell her that, oh, this is actually something very common to Hong Kongers. A lot of brides would wear a phoenix crown when they were getting married in a traditional Chinese gown. And a lot of Hong Kong brides would like to dye their hair just before their weddings, usually a shade of blonde. And I would tell her that a lot of older generations of Hong Kong people doesn't really approve of very dramatic colors in the hair. So these kinds of cultural references would be a sort of hint for the translator to see what I was going for in terms of the imagery I wanted to evoke when the audience sees the libretto on the subtitle screen, or what my intentions were, or the intertextualities that I brought into the libretto. Because the original story of The Cold, written by Xishi, is very famous for referencing classical Chinese poetry and contemporary poetry by Ya Xuan. And I brought that aspect into my libretto as well, but sometimes not necessarily referencing the exact lines or the exact poems from the original. So I would also mark those in the margins so that Jennifer would know which poems I was speaking about. So I feel like in this process of working with Jennifer as the translator, I was able to revisit the libretto and understand what I did in the process of writing it and polishing it, and to understand all of the complex elements that actually went into it. Sort of almost like an analyst or a critic. And I find that sort of experience really fascinating as well, because I rarely do that with my own work. But having to communicate clearly and constantly with so many people involved in the production of a chamber opera, I find that the process of communication is in itself an education to myself as a writer as well. So these are the very unique things that I've experienced as a librettist. I was actually interested in this magazine since I was a teenager. So when Fleur de Lettres was first founded in 2006, I was in secondary school and I was just starting to be very interested in Hong Kong literature. And I would go with my friends to a lot of cultural events or to listen to writers talk about their work in local bookstores. And I still remember going to the launch party of Fleur de Lettres when it was in 2006. Back then, I already knew that this magazine was edited by a group of young people around in their late 20s or early 30 years old. And this magazine would address a lot of interesting cultural phenomenon or be very thought-provoking and make literature sound a lot of fun. Also, it had this, they're very dedicated to giving a space for up-and-coming writers to have a voice in the magazine. So back in the day, they would have a special section dedicated to younger people who might not be an established writer yet to send in their work. If it's good enough, they would publish it in the magazine, and the editors of the magazine would actually write their comments in the magazine. And I found that it was a very encouraging and interesting way for me as a young person to understand what good writing could look like, or what other people see in my writing that they find fascinating. So ever since getting to know this magazine back in the day, I had been a reader and contributor to the magazine throughout the years. And after I finished my master's degree in London and coming back to Hong Kong in 2017, I was invited to join the magazine as an editor. And I've been in this position ever since. And I've really enjoyed being able to carry the torch and keep this magazine going, because there's this really interesting tradition to this magazine where the editors would always be kept at an average age of around 30 years old. People would join the editorial board and leave after a couple of years, after they feel like they've done all they have, or that they want to try something else. This is the sort of way that Fleur de Lettres tries to keep things fresh and to bring in the perspectives of young people so that it can speak to the issues that actually are relevant to us today, without the feeling that it's the same old people doing the same old things over and over again for decades and decades. So I'm glad that as a person of the age range of a typical Fleur de Lettres editor, I was offered the opportunity to join them in their work, and I'm really enjoying doing this, and I hope to continue doing it for a while. One of the things that I think characterizes Fleur de Lettres in terms of what it does in the Hong Kong literary scene is that we create discussions and spaces for people to think about issues that are interesting. For example, when we as editors curate a feature special, we would always be asking ourselves why we are presenting this particular topic, and whether the form that we're presenting it in does the best job in presenting those things. When we invite writers to contribute to our features, or when we plan interviews with interesting people who might have something exciting to say about the topics we would like to discuss, we always keep that in mind. The question of whether what we are trying to say using the magazine is relevant and digs into the issues deep enough that it gets people to think about things a little bit differently. So we do have a pretty high standard with ourselves as editors. And I like to think that readers see Fleur de Lettres as a sort of benchmark of what good writing can look like. I've heard that a lot of people would think that Fleur de Lettres has a really high standard in terms of what kind of writings we would accept from creative writers. And once you made it into the magazine, that means you've made a sort of standard, or you've reached a certain height. I'm not necessarily sure if that is the case with a lot of people, but I do know that some people feel that way. And when I was starting as a creative writer, I felt that way too. I think that speaks to a sort of legacy of the magazine when it first started having, when the magazine first started, they had a section specially dedicated to new and emerging writers, and now we also try to do that, perhaps in the form of the print magazine Fleur de Lettres, or we also have an online magazine where we would accept writing from all over the world, and we would accept a lot of writing from young people in Hong Kong. We would also try to help young writers in Hong Kong publish their books through Spicy Fish Cultural Productions, which also publishes Fleur de Lettres, the magazine. So a lot of these things we're doing, we're trying to make sure that high quality writing from local writers, especially the up and coming writers, would get to have a voice through our platform as a magazine, or as a cultural production agency that helps publish things and helps send writers to cultural exchange programs around the world. I like to think that we are giving opportunities to people who have real talent and who can produce good works, and try to help them find a bigger readership. So I think that is sort of how I would characterize the work I see being done with Fleur de Lettres. The radio program Book Review by RTHK, it's very interesting. It started its first episode in 1983, so it's been on air for almost 40 years right now. And it has a tradition of inviting local writers to be one of the hosts of the radio show and talk about literature and books and reading and publishing, issues that perhaps would not be so popular with other channels such as commercial radio or commercial television stations, because RTHK doesn't really have the kind of burden of having to show the financial gain from all of its programs. I feel like Book Review is a very rare opportunity for literature to be discussed in the public using the wavelengths of a public radio. So I think that in itself is already a very unique and important thing, to make sure that there's a voice of literature freely accessible to everyone every week. And the legacy of this program being hosted by Hong Kong writers gives me a sense of having to make sure that I do the best work I can as a radio host, because the long lineage of hosts before me, a lot of them are very prominent writers in Hong Kong, and they have their very unique perspectives in reading and how they would go about discussing these books and making them sound interesting to a general audience. And when I try to imagine what the show would look like with me as one of the hosts, I would also try to make sure that I honor that sort of legacy that is set in place by the generations and generations of hosts before me. So I would ask myself whether the books that I would like to talk about on air addresses important issues, or they bring a fresh perspective in terms of storytelling, or whether that writer has interesting and important things to say. If I find that it is suitable, then I would invite these writers to come onto the show and share with us their work processes, what inspired their writing, how they felt about publishing their recent works. And I find that it's often both enjoyable to myself as a host and the audience, as well as for the person being interviewed. Because a lot of times, writers in Hong Kong or people who are interested in the arts don't really feel appreciated on a day-to-day basis. We sort of unfortunately live in a city where we often prioritize professions that are more prestigious in terms of learning of earning a lot more money than someone who would be a writer or an artist. But by giving writers a platform on public radio, a lot of people are very excited and feel like that this is a very significant form of recognition, because there's this show that are willing to have them on and give them time and space to talk about their work and possibly get the tens of thousands of people who listen to the show interested in what they do. I find that to be important and enjoyable to myself as well. I find that everyone I meet would definitely have something to teach me and to teach everyone. There would definitely be things that only that person knows, or the way they speak about something that we're familiar with might inspire us to see the world in a different light too. So I feel like by being one of the hosts on Book Review, I was able to engage in direct conversation with a lot of great minds in Hong Kong and sort of carry the torch in giving the opportunity to many great writers in Hong Kong to present their works on such a public platform. And I hope to be able to keep on doing that and be better at everything that I do with the radio show. When I first joined the show Book Review as a new host, I had already been working as an editor at Fleur de Lettres for quite some time. And my experiences as an editor of a literary magazine is that they are no less important than creative writers or publishers, because editors of magazines actually curate a space for people to tell their stories and present their works and writings. And the way they create that space and maintain it through each and every issue that they publish periodically is something very important. They would have their own editorial decisions, they would have their own perspectives in what they want for their magazines and the sort of stories that they want to tell by piecing together different contributions from writers, from photographers, illustrators, translators, and many other people who might be able to bring something new to the magazine. So when I first joined Book Review, I thought it would be exciting to show people what the different magazines in Hong Kong are doing. Before I started this series on the show, I didn't really realize how many magazines there were and are starting to be published in Hong Kong. So even during the first year of me hosting the show, there have been new publications coming up in Hong Kong targeting different readerships. So we have new magazines who wanted to teach local secondary school students how to write good book reviews. There are new magazines who wanted to show people that serious literary criticism is worthy of having its own publication in Hong Kong, so that literary criticism can help contribute to the discussion around literary works and perhaps even help inspire the creation of new texts and new ideas. So I feel like by inviting so many different editors from different magazines onto the show, I was able to learn from them both as an editor myself and as a member of the audience who may not be familiar with these magazines, but through their sharings of what they do with the magazines and what they envision is a good magazine, we are able to see how these people are actually shaping the way we think and see the literary world around us, or getting to understand and feel their passion of their work in itself is already very encouraging, because working as an editor, particularly as an editor of a literary magazine in Hong Kong, is definitely not one of the most profitable professions that you can do. It has so much work involved, and it asks for so much knowledge and wisdom from you as a person that it sometimes almost seems like it's not worth it if you calculate how much money you might make from all of the hours of hard work that you put into it. But despite all this, there are still so many people who put in so much effort into the magazines that they take care of, and with so much passion and doing it at such a high level that I always find myself inspired by their passion and their hard work. And every time after speaking to them, I know that I am not alone in what I find important and interesting. And I would feel that there are people out there who are just like me, who all still like literature and are willing to put in the effort in helping create spaces in magazines for people to present their works. So even just by engaging in that kind of personal connection with the guests on the show, I feel like I learned so much from them that I just want to keep on doing this and helping people see that Hong Kong literature has so much fun and great platforms in publishing in it. Perhaps some of the new readers would be inspired by the show to pick up a copy, or perhaps even subscribe to some of them. That would be a really grand wish that I ultimately hope that we'll be able to achieve. But even if we don't get any new business for the magazines, I genuinely hope that their stories and sharings would inspire people, because well, at least I am very inspired. I assume that by anthologizing you mean the collection of writings from more than one writer into one cohesive book. And if we're talking about that kind of anthologizing, I think it's very important, because it is a way of presenting to the reader of the anthology the result of great research. I would imagine that the person who puts together an anthology would need to read very broadly in the area from which he's collecting the works. He would need to know the characteristics of each and every writer, and whether that particular piece or writer is worthy of being in the anthology, or specifically what it can contribute to the narrative presented in the anthology, or what significance it has by being in it. So I would say that an anthology is the end product of a hugely labor-intensive and very important research work that involves aesthetic appreciation. It involves knowledge of literary criticism. It also involves a sense of what is important to the readers of this generation that prompted the need to have this anthology. And I think that to readers, it is a great way to start to learn about an area of literature. So for example, personally, I've collected anthologies of poetry that are surrounded by various themes. So I have read poetry anthologies that are surrounding a particular generation of poets from a particular place. I have read poetry collections centered around the theme of bereavement or love. personally, my short stories have also been included in anthologies of short stories being published and written in a certain period of time in Hong Kong, or in themed anthologies. So for example, there would be anthologies about writing about nature in Hong Kong. And I feel like these categories that stories are put into help us understand the theme much better. And as a reader, it would be easier and quicker to just go to the anthology than to do the huge amount of reading that the editor of the anthology must have done to be able to put it together. And I find that some readers actually got to know my works through anthologies as well. Some of the works that have been collected in anthologies I have not yet put into my own short story collections, but before I was able to put them in my own book, some readers already found them in anthologies and would like to take them and make them into a different art form or present it in a different way, or even teach it in university. So I think it would be an important way of disseminating works of literature and to connect with readers who might not have a lot of time or the ability to read so broadly and understand each and every writer by reading their individual personal publications. So I feel like the anthology is sort of like a literary magazine or a department store, if you will, where you get a curated collection of pieces that a reader can approach easily and start their own reading journey with. And in terms of Hong Kong specifically, I would say that anthologizing about Hong Kong would be very good in getting people more excited about reading works from Hong Kong. Recently there had been debates online from overseas about whether Hong Kong has no literature written by people who are born and raised here, or sometimes even as an editor myself, when I was thinking about who might be a possible candidate for us to approach for asking about if they would like to contribute to our magazines, we would sometimes even open up an anthology as a sort of sampler to see what styles they write in, what sort of themes they're interested in, or who is actually actively publishing. So I feel like it's sort of even like a phone directory of sorts for writers in terms of me as an editor needing that sort of information. So there are a lot of ways that anthologies can be used by different people who want to get to know the literary scene very quickly or with a specific goal in mind. And I feel like Hong Kong literature in particular needs that. So I definitely hope that more and more people would be able to put more anthologies about Hong Kong literature together. Well, there's always the cliche that Hong Kong is a cultural desert and that nobody likes to read. Nobody is willing to pay good money to go see a theatre performance, but they're willing to spend a lot of money on an all-day breakfast and a latte. I find that these cliches are sometimes true, especially if we think about how underpaid a lot of creators and editors and art administrators are in the city. But despite all of these challenges, there are still so many people in Hong Kong who are passionate and talented and competent in doing all of the work in culture that they do. We have people who are very passionate about becoming great art administrators and help artists reach a bigger audience. We have writers and artists who push themselves to actualize the best work that they can. There are also people who are very passionate readers, consumers of culture and literature, who would take time out of their busy schedules to come to a poetry reading or go see a movie that a local movie director has produced, or buy their books and put them on a bookshelf. And you know how important that is, because Hong Kong is such a teeny tiny place that allocating precious real estate area in your home to a book can be a sort of investment and recognition of worth I would say that the cultural scene in Hong Kong is sort of weirdly encouraging to me in that way, because even though a lot of the people who produce or consume cultural products in Hong Kong are on the margin and not really in the spotlight all the time, they still do it. And that must be something that they are so passionate about that they are willing to do it, despite all of the sort of letdowns from perhaps not getting recognized by society a lot, or not earning a lot of money, or sometimes even being questioned, or you yourself questioning whether it's still worth it to be an editor or be a writer. And I think by seeing that there are still so many people who are passionate about it, I remain very hopeful that the cultural scene of Hong Kong will remain very creative and very energetic, and still willing to put the best work forward whilst on the margins and not in the spotlight all the time. I think as a writer and as a person, there's this innate drive within me to be creative and for self-actualization. So it gives me pleasure to be able to put out a good piece of work that I knew that I had pushed my abilities as an artist, and I have made my craft better by creating better stories. But there's also this very human instinct of wanting to connect with other people. I'm not particularly a very outgoing person in real life, but I find that through writing, I am able to engage in conversation with other people in the city, and without having to actually physically engage with them face to face. And a lot of times, the stories that I produce are able to even travel further than I physically can to readerships outside of Hong Kong, or perhaps even, I would imagine, perhaps even if I died and someone found my book, my stories would still be able to tell them something about the experiences I had as a person in Hong Kong as of this moment. So these very natural instincts of wanting to do the best you can and to connect with other people and communicate, I think they really do drive my writing. So in terms of a writer, I would still want to continue to better my work and keep on working hard at producing high quality writings, and try my best to show them to more people so that we can have a wider discussion and get more people interested in Hong Kong, or in the form of short stories, or in reading and writing. That would be something that I would really like to achieve. And in terms of editing, I find that editing is a very important thing to me, because I like to invite people to join discussions and to hear voices from different perspectives. And being an editor allows me to do that with the platform of a magazine. I feel like that is a responsibility and a privilege. Being an editor means that you have to put in a lot of work and be selfless in a lot of ways. And since so many people before me have done that and created so many magazines that we still read to this day, including Fleur de Lettres that I now work at, I feel like I have a sort of responsibility to help take care of it in my own little way, until it's time to let the next generation of editors take it over and continue this legacy and maintain that space for everyone. So now I would try my best to take care of the area of work that is allocated to me in the magazine, and I hope to continue to be able to bring in new and exciting voices and give spaces to people who might have good stories to tell and show them to a wider readership. So that would be the sort of goal that I want to achieve as an editor.